Hello everybody, welcome to the first post on the Master and Margarita. I'm going to read out what I wrote in my Substack essay, just so that I can put it out as a podcast for all you podcast listeners. I do enjoy listening to Simon Hazel's War and Peace podcasts in that way. And of course, as soon as I hit record, Willow the cat is going to come and say hello. She just loves to be on my videos. Actually, yes, I'm recording this as a video as well. And I'll put it out on my YouTube just to cover all the bases. So, I've had a great time with this. We're looking at chapters 1 to 5. And I have the subtitle, Cowardice is the most terrible of vices. Follow me, reader. Welcome to the first post on the Master and Margarita. I don't know about you, but I'm having the time of my life with this novel. The slow reading process is enhancing my enjoyment immeasurably. I'm also reading and listening to a lot of supplementary material, but I'll try not to get too bogged down in academia for these posts. My goal is to encourage everyone to read this novel. I know that Russian classics can seem intimidating, but they really aren't. I hope I can help you with that. Translation points. I have a particular interest in translation, having worked in that field myself for many years. However, I recognise that this is a specialist interest, so I shall try to refrain from including too many examples of variances I find interesting. I discussed the different translations in my introductory post, so I'll direct you there and perhaps update that with anything that I think would be of interest. Chapter 1. Never Talk to Strangers. We're at Patriarch's Ponds in Moscow with two characters, Mikhail Alexandrovich Berlioz, 40-ish, well-dressed, an editor, and Ivan Nikolaevich Bezdomny, a young man and a poet. I know I just said I wasn't going to discuss translation points, but the names are important, given that I'll be referring to this character throughout this slow read. Here's how the 6 translations I have deal with Bezdomny. Ginsberg, 1967, homeless. Glennie, 1967, Bezdomny. O'Connor Burgeon, 1995, Bezdomny. Pevirin Volokonsky, 1997, homeless. Carpelson, 2006, homeless. Aplin, 2008, Bezdomny. So we have an even split, with only 2 translators providing footnotes. So that's Pevirin Volokonsky and Aplin. I've included these footnotes in the text as, well, footnotes. My preference is Bezdomny with a footnote. Pevirin Volokonsky's footnotes are particularly helpful out of all the translations. I'll be referring to this character as Bezdomny throughout. Just putting the cat down lest she hit a space bar or something and stop the recording. That has happened before. Berlioz experiences a moment of terror and sees a vision of a 7-foot-tall man in a checked jacket and jockey cap. The apparition appears to hover around the ground before disappearing, while Berlioz has his eyes closed. Berlioz pulls himself together, putting it down to the heat, and continues his conversation with Bezdomny. They're discussing an anti-religious poem Bezdomny has been commissioned to write. It leads to a discussion of whether Jesus was real, a discussion that is overheard by a seemingly foreign gentleman who just happens to be in the park. This is Voland, who is, broadly speaking, the devil, though they don't know that yet, and neither do we. He's well dressed and is carrying a walking cane with a handle in the shape of a poodle's head, a reference to Faust. Remember that the epigraph at the beginning of the novel is a direct quote from Faust. The whole novel has a Faustian feel. Voland introduces himself and expresses his delight at overhearing their conversation about Jesus. He applauds their atheism. As a side note, it's worth noting that in Soviet Russia, Orthodox Christianity was outlawed. They discuss the 5 proofs of God's existence and how the philosopher Immanuel Kant refuted them, and in so doing created a kind of 6th proof. I had no idea what these proofs were, so I looked them up and present them here, briefly, for your enjoyment. 1. The cosmological proof, first cause/prime mover. 2. The teleological proof, design/purpose. 3. The ontological proof, existence from definition. 4. The moral proof, moral law. And 5. The historical/consensus proof, universal belief. I started to feel bogged down in philosophy as I researched this, and it's not my strong suit. Suffice to say that Berlioz and Bias Domini see Kant's position as intolerable, that God cannot be proved or disproved by theoretical reason, and incarceration in Solovki would be too good for him. Voland mentions having spoken to Kant at breakfast and goes on to say that he's in a place far more remote than Solovki and has been for more than 100 years. Solovki is one of those Soviet cultural touchstones that Bulgakov's readers would have identified with. These are among the most challenging parts of the novel for the translators. It refers to the Solovyetsky Islands above the Arctic Circle and the White Sea, where an old monastery was converted into a prison camp. Voland opens up further philosophical discussion. Quote, "But this is the question that's troubling me. If there's no God, then who, one wonders, is directing human life and all order on earth in general?" To which Bias Domini angrily responds that, quote, "Man himself is directing it," end quote. Voland sees that Bias Domini is gasping for a cigarette and asks him what his favourite brand is. Upon naming the brand, Voland produces exactly that brand of cigarette in an ornate case. Is this another reference to Faust? Laura D. Weeks reminds us that at Auerbach's cellar, Mephistopheles gives each of the drunkards his favourite brand of wine. And that's a quote from A Critical Companion. The chapter ends with Voland's insistence that Jesus did exist. No proof is required because he, Voland, was there. Chapter 2, Pontius Pilate. I love the way the novel transitions from chapter 1 to chapter 2 by repeating the same passage. I don't know that I've seen that technique used anywhere else. We now shift from Moscow to Pontius Pilate's palace. Voland recounts the tale of the trial of Jesus, known in the text as Yeshua ha Nostri, before Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea. Pilate is suffering from a headache. The hot sun is blinding him and he just wants to lie down in a dark room with his dog. He even dreams of taking poison. Yeshua explains to the procurator that all power is violence over people, and that a time will come when there will be no power of the Caesars nor any other power. Man will pass into the kingdom of truth and justice, where generally there will be no need for any power at all. End quote. Seditious talk like that will get you killed. Cowardice and the swallow. Cowardice is a strong theme of the novel. Pilate is suffering when Yeshua comes before him. Yeshua has been sentenced to death by the Sanhedrin, and he's been sent to the procurator to ratify the sentence. A swallow flies in and the procurator appears to mellow. His headache eases. The swallow appears as something free, ungovernable by the rigid structure of Rome. Forgiveness seems possible. He concludes that Yeshua is not, in fact, guilty of anything besides being mentally ill. He decides to sentence Yeshua to exile from the city of Yerushalayim, which is Jerusalem. It's a fleeting moment of courage for the procurator. The swallow flits away, whereupon the procurator reads another document indicting Yeshua. His headache flares up again, and he has a vision of Yeshua's head floating off. Keep this decapitation motif in mind for later. And being replaced by the rotting head of Emperor Tiberius. He hears a voice evoking the law of lese majesty, in Roman lex majestatis. The footnotes of the Penguin edition explain, quote, Pilate's nightmarish vision is of the aged Emperor Tiberius, 42 BC to AD 37, who spent many years in seclusion on the island of Capri, where he succumbed to all sorts of vicious passions. The law of lese majesty, offence against the sovereign people or authority, existed in Rome under the Republic. It was revived by Augustus and given wide application by Tiberius. Pilate realizes that the words of Yeshua could be considered as seditious against Emperor Tiberius and Rome. The flitting swallow allowed Pilate a moment of freedom from his pain and gave him a glimpse of the truth of Yeshua's words, or at least of the idea that Yeshua's crimes were not worthy of the death penalty. The swallow's departure brings him back to a place of fear and cowardice. The next time the swallow appears, Pilate is not influenced by it at all, and instead ratifies the Lesser Sanhedrin's death sentence. The swallow no longer serves as a representation of freedom, truth and forgiveness, but is now a witness to the procurator's cowardly decision. Stalin's Article 58. The law of lex majestatis mirrors Stalin's Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code. A. Criminalising thought and speech. Lex majestatis, words, prophecies or interpretations could be treason. Article 58. Anti-Soviet agitation, defeatist talk or insufficient enthusiasm for the cause. No violent act is required. Meaning is inferred by power, not intended by the speaker. Yeshua speaks of a world without violence, of truth, of no more Caesars. He's speaking from a place of love rather than of rebellion, and Pilate feels this when the swallow enters for the first time. But his fear and cowardice reign supreme, and so he makes the decision that he does. As Frank Herbert memorably put it in June, fear is the mind killer. B. Retroactive guilt. Both laws are vaguely defined, infinitely expandable, and can be applied retroactively. Pilate's terror is not that Yeshua has committed treason, but that it could be said that he had. Pilate would then be accused of failing to prevent it. This mirrors the Stalinist reality that guilt is often retroactive and that denunciation creates the crime. C. Cowardice becomes rational and fatal. Under both systems, being merciful is dangerous and hesitation leads to suspicion. Pilate understands this perfectly. This is why his inner monologue is so precise and so damning. And that headache and the blinding hot sun ramp up the tension of his moral collapse. He's not evil, he's just cowardly and self-seeking. Quote, the procurator had the vague feeling there was something he had not finished saying to the condemned man, something he had not finished hearing. Pilate banished this thought, and it flew away in an instant, just as it had come. It flew away, but the anguish remained unexplained, for it could not possibly be explained by the other brief thought that came in a flash, like lightning, but that was extinguished straight away. Internal monologue. Immortality. Immortality has come. Whose immortality had come? That the procurator did not understand, but the thought of this mysterious immortality made him turn cold in the full blaze of the sun. End quote. The procurator is suffering. What does he mean by his declaration of immortality? It could be the immortality of the moment, a moment in history that once written will have consequences that reverberate through time. He could have chosen mercy. He wishes he had chosen mercy, but he was cowardly and had an intuition that the moment will be forever written, immortal. It's a moment when time hardens into eternal consequence. Pilate knows this and acts anyway. His get-out clause was that he thought the Sanhedrin would free Yeshua at the Passover feast, but that's not the way it plays out. Led by High Priest Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin frees Bar Rabban, a known revolutionary and murderer. It leads to division between the church, Caiaphas, and the state, Pilate. Look out for the hooded character with whom Pilate has a meeting. Quote, while the secretary was convening the conference, the procurator had a meeting in a room obscured from the sun by dark blinds with some sort of man whose face was half covered by a hood, though the rays of the sun could not possibly have troubled him inside the room. This meeting was extremely brief. The procurator said a few quiet words to the man, after which the latter withdrew, while Pilate went through the colonnade into the garden. He will appear again, and we'll discuss more when he does. Consider what kind of characters Stalin might have had secret discussions with. Chapter 3, The Seventh Proof. We're back at Patriarch's Ponds. There's a full moon. Voland claims to have been on the balcony with Pilate, quote, only secretly, incognito, so to speak, end quote. We're reminded of his one black eye and one green eye. Quote, I've only just arrived this moment in Moscow, replied the professor, perplexed, and only at this point did the friends think to look properly into his eyes, and they satisfied themselves that the left, the green one, was completely mad, while the right one was empty, black, and dead. End quote. It implies that Voland is seeing two worlds, Moscow in the present and eternity beyond time, or human truth and eternal consequence. Voland asks Berlioz and Biesdomny whether the devil is real, to which Biesdomny loudly responds that he is not. This causes Voland to burst out into laughter. The two Muscovites question the veracity of Voland's story, seeing as it doesn't coincide with the Gospels. Voland replies that, quote, absolutely nothing of what is written in the Gospels ever actually happened. And if we start referring to the Gospels as a historical source, end quote. One of Bulgakov's early titles for the pilot story was The Gospel According to the Devil, and later The Gospel According to Voland. And what is this seventh proof of the chapter title? Berlioz and Biesdomny both agree that Voland is mad. Berlioz decides to make an excuse so he can go and make a call to the authorities to alert them that there is a mad foreigner at Patriarch's Ponds. Before he heads off to make the call, Voland implores him to believe that the devil exists, stating that the seventh proof will soon become evident. Berlioz once again meets the apparition that he'd seen earlier in the park when he'd come over all queer. We don't yet know his name, only a description. In the Paviran Volokonsky translation, he's referred to as an ex-choirmaster, same in the Burgeon O'Connor and Carpelson. Aplin refers to him as an ex-precentor, while Glennie has him as a church choirmaster. In Russian, he's a bывший regent. As much as I'm enjoying the Aplin translation, I prefer church choirmaster here, as it keeps the ecclesiastical resonance clear. The seventh proof then emerges, which is that Berlioz is decapitated by a tram driven by a woman after slipping on some oil spilt by Anushka, just as Voland prophesied. The devil is real. The supernatural has intruded into ordinary life. Chapter 4, The Pursuit. Biesdomny's freaked out by what happened to Berlioz, understandably so. He approaches Voland and sees the ex-choirmaster for the first time. He's wearing, quote, an obviously unnecessary pince-nez, which had one lens missing completely and the other cracked, end quote. Biesdomny asks the professor to confess to his identity, whereupon the professor suddenly no longer speaks nor understands Russian. We're soon introduced to the third character of Voland's crew, the Black Tomcat. It's a bit slapstick here as the cat, walking on its hind legs, attempts to board a tram. Bulgakov tells us that the passengers were not so much freaked out by the fact of the cat's boarding the tram, but by its attempting to pay. The cat turned out to be not only a solvent, but also a disciplined beast. He's ejected from the tram and then hops onto the back as it passes by for a free ride, making his escape. The ex-choirmaster gets away on a bus, leaving only Voland. Biesdomny pursues him, but can't keep up and loses him. But then he suddenly realised that Voland must be in flat 47 of house number 13. Where did this idea come from? We can only speculate that this idea is implanted by Voland. Reason is no longer in charge, being replaced instead by the supernatural. Biesdomny is in a suggestible state after Berlioz's death. It's a deliberately awkward scene in the apartment. Biesdomny faces reality in the face of his supernatural quest. A naked woman is soaping herself in the bath with a loofah. He leaves, taking a candle and an icon with him, but the narrator tells us that nobody knows why. Quote, nobody knows what idea took possession of Ivan at this point, but before running out onto the back entrance, he appropriated one of those candles and also the little paper icon. End quote. Remember that Biesdomny is an atheist. Is he grabbing these religious symbols as talismans against the supernatural? His next idea is that Voland is almost sure to be on the Moskva River. Another implanted idea? Or is he simply losing his marbles? Quote, It would quite likely have been the right thing to ask Ivan Nikolaevich why he supposed the professor was specifically on the Moscow River and not in some other place. But the trouble is that there was no one to ask him. End quote. I just love this humorous style. Bezdomny ends up diving into the Moskva River and loses his clothes on the riverbank. It's rather a ridiculous scene, and it makes me think that he's being mentally led a merry dance by Voland. Does he really think that Voland is actually in the river? He climbs out the river to find only a striped pair of long johns, a torn shirt, his candle, the icon, and a box of matches. He dresses in these items and then decides to head to the headquarters of Masalit, known simply as Griboyedov. On his way, he hears the Polonaise from the opera Eugene Onegin, which you can hear too in a YouTube link I've included in my essay. It's a terrific piece of music. Eugene Onegin was written by Pushkin, the first great Russian literary figure, and is told entirely in verse. Most Russians know it, and Bezdomny certainly would have. The opera by Tchaikovsky is also very well known. I had the pleasure of seeing it performed in Odessa in 1996. I also read it that year, being guided by my teacher. If Bezdomny's hearing the music while under Voland's spell, it could be that the music is coming from his own soul, as something to anchor him to reality, something well known, loved and familiar. Just like in Season 4 of Stranger Things, which I just happen to be rewatching at the moment. I love when disparate works of art spread over time are connected by ideas in that way. Chapter 5. There were goings-on at Griboyedov. Quote, But then the devil knows, and perhaps he did. It's not important. End quote. The Griboyedov is home to Masalit, the Writers' Guild of which Berlioz was chairman. And I've got a footnote here which doesn't work in draft form, so I'll scroll down and find it for you and then make my way back up again. Masalit is a parody of the Russian Association of Proletarian Writers, RAPP, Российская Ассоциация Пролетарских Писателей, the predecessor of the Writers' Union, so despised by Bulgakov and his close associates. The Griboyedov is the house of writers on Herzen Street, and Perelegino is the writers' colony of Peredelkino outside of Moscow. Now I've got to get back up to where I was. Scroll. We get a description of the building's various rooms and the organisation's offerings. Writing retreats, housing, fishing, and the best restaurant in Moscow. The restaurant is described to us in an excellent example of Bulgakov's skaz narration. Skaz is a type of narration in which prose is written as if spoken. The word itself derives from raskazat, the Russian verb to tell. Skazka means story. Skaz narration is irreverent and ridiculous, featuring repetition and idiomatic lower-class language. We have a dialogue between Ambrosi and Foka about the cuisine in the Griboyedov restaurant. Quote, I don't have any particular know-how, Ambrosi objected. Just an ordinary desire to live like a human being. What you mean to say, Foka, is that you can come across pike perch at the Colosseum too. But at the Colosseum, a portion of pike perch costs 13 rubles 15 kopecks, whereas here it's 5.50. Apart from that, at the Colosseum, the pike perch is 3 days old. And apart from that, you have no guarantee either that at the Colosseum you won't get a bunch of grapes in the face from the first young man that comes bursting in from the Teatralny Passage. No, I'm categorically against the Colosseum. The gourmet Ambrosi thundered for the whole boulevard to hear. Don't try and persuade me, Foka. End quote. Bulgakov is giving us a glimpse of Moscow through this dialogue, but we don't enter it entirely. Instead, it's presented as an example of a conversation once heard by the author of these most truthful lines beside the cast iron railings of Griboyedov. In that sense, it's not pure skaz, such as we see in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or James Kelman's wonderful novel How Late It Was, How Late, where the skaz narration tells the entire story. It's more of an example of Ska's narrations being presented in a frame. Bulgakov then pulls us out of the Ska's frame with one of the novel's most famous lines. Quote, "But that's enough. You're being distracted. Reader, follow me." And then I've got an image here of the inside flap of the Penguin Deluxe Classic Edition, which has that quotation in Russian. "За мной читатель" is illustrated by Christopher Cohn Askew. 12 writers at Griboyedov, 12 disciples. They don't know Berlioz is dead. They're all waiting for Berlioz to start the meeting that was scheduled for 10 p.m, the one Berlioz mentioned to Voland at Patriarchs. We learn some names and get some banter. Then we're with the mortician. He's wondering whether to sew Berlioz's head back on. The writers go down to the restaurant for dinner and the band strikes up at midnight. Dancing ensues. Ostranение, or defamiliarization. Ostranение is a technique that takes something familiar and subverts it by adding another element. When Voland appears in the restaurant at midnight as, quote, "a handsome black-eyed man in tails," end quote, Bulgakov tells us what the mystics say, that the devil is a swashbuckling pirate sailing, quote, "the Caribbean beneath a funereal black flag bearing a skull," end quote. Bulgakov then flips the Ostranение switch, but instead of the typical use of the technique of adding something strange to something familiar, he does the opposite. Quote, "But no, the seductive mystics lie," end quote. We are presented with ordinary, mundane things. A sorry lime tree, a cast iron railing, the boulevard, ice is melting in a bowl, a vision in hell. End quote. Berlioz! The word spreads that Berlioz has been killed. His deputy at Massalit, Jules Debin, who had been at the morgue and has now returned to Griboyedov, calls together the 12 board members to discuss arrangements. Bezdomny appears in his long johns and is in quite a state. He informs them all to beware of the consultant, but can't remember his name other than that it starts with a W. He ends up being taken away to the mental hospital to be incarcerated. And there we end this week's reading. I must admit that I'm learning so much on this close read. At this point, I've switched almost exclusively to the Applin translation, and I find it to be very smooth. I'm reading a lot of supplementary material and have started a list for your information in case you'd like to go deeper into the source texts. I'm wary of making these essays too long, I think I've failed there, or providing too much academic info. I'd actually rather just have discussions and try not to let these essays get too highbrow. The idea is that this literature is for everyone, not just academics. I've heard from some of you in the comments that you started this book one time and put it down again, or that you've always felt intimidated by Russian literature. My challenge is to lead you through the novel by pointing out some ideas, symbols and themes without going too deep into academia. Hopefully some of the ideas I'm reading about in the supplementary texts will come through in these weekly essays. Let me know in the comments what you think of the first 5 chapters. Is this the novel you expected? Have you passed the point of a previous DNF? Is the time switching from 1920s Russia to the Yeshua and Pilate chapter and back again jarring? Me? I'm having the time of my life, and I hope that you're all enjoying it too. See you next week for chapters 6 to 10.